This is Nigel Uzi for CB on My Skin, and today I'm at the Falzer Club in East Falls, Philadelphia, and with my guest, Gary Lee. Gary Lee has been a part of the Philadelphia music scene for over 40 years as a bass guitarist. He knows almost everyone in the music industry here. He's played with the Daves, the Deb Callahan Band, the Charlie Crystal Band, Ben Arnold, and Joseph Parsons, only to name a few. He also grew up in my neighborhood, which is Germantown. I'm looking forward to hearing about him um, and how things have changed in this neighborhood.
Right. Absolutely.
You grew up in this Germantown in the 60s and 70s. What's
Yeah.
it like compared to now?
Germantown, at that time, listen, Germantown has always been one of Germantown and Mount Airy, because you sort of kind of live on the border of the two, right? Has always been a relatively diverse neighborhood. All sorts of people, working class and professionals and stuff like that. It was, I think, much more community-centered when I was growing up. In other words, we all knew, everybody in the neighborhood knew each other. If you did something wrong in the neighborhood, you'd hear about it that night from somebody's mother. You know what I mean? It was a time when the Philadelphia public school system was great. You could go to your neighborhood school and actually get a good education, not have to worry so much about violence or anything like that. You know what I mean? We all went to school together. We all came home for lunch together. And in my particular case, my mother used to, she was a stay-at-home mom at the time. She would make lunch for all the kids that came home from school. You know what I mean? It was Campbell's tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. You know what I mean? And we'd all sit around together. But it was a very walkable neighborhood and relatively safe. And there was a lot of folks that had moved, like for us, for instance, had moved from North Philadelphia up to Germantown, and that was a big move at the time. It was sort of like you were getting out of, the poorer section of town and moving up to what was really a middle-class neighborhood. So it was a good time to be there. The parents were very, very involved in the schools, and so it was all those huge Germantown houses were still one house. They weren't broken up into apartments, and so it was a good time to be there in Germantown.
I think kind of compared to now, Germantown is kind of one of the most interesting neighborhoods because there was, this entire project to make it one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Philly.
Right.
And I think now it's kind of being slowly taken apart because really there's not really that much community that I see anymore.
Okay.
In the area.
Yeah. There's a lot of that's going on in a lot of neighborhoods in Philadelphia, especially here in East Falls we're talking about, because a lot of folks that, as the world has gotten more expensive, a lot of folks that maybe would have moved to New York or something like that for their careers are now settling here in this area because, relatively speaking, it's still cheaper than living in Manhattan or something like that. But when we were growing up, it was all families. It was just all families. We all had the same goals, and everybody, and for the most part, and this is a period a long time ago, for the most part, the dads went out to work, and the moms, for a lot of times, were stay-at-home moms. Not that that's, a model that needs to be kept, but that's just the way that it was. You know what I mean? And the moms would sort of be home taking care of the kids is what they were doing. But there were always two sides to Germantown. There was West Germantown, which is where you are. But we used to live over near Washington Lane and Green Street over
Oh,
that way.
really?
Yeah, and that's where you. And there were several musicians actually that lived on that block. One notably is we lived next door to near, not next door, but near the Eubanks family, and Robin Eubanks was a trombone player, and his brother Kevin actually was the guitar player on the Tonight Show.
Oh,
You're,
okay.
yeah, but so was that part, and then there was East Germantown, over near where LaSalle is. I don't know. Do you know where that LaSalle University is?
Yeah.
Yeah. And at that time, that neighborhood was solidly Italian and Irish, you know, at the time. And when my parents got divorced, which is a whole nother story, we moved over to that part of Germantown because houses were like affordable. But a lot of the families then were starting to move out. That's when the neighborhood started going down a little bit hill, and a lot of the families started moving out. And so that was sort of kind of the beginning of not the demise, but the downfall in a slightly of that part of Germantown. But Germantown has actually been, Germantown and Mount Airy, especially, have been nationally recognized as one of the most diverse communities in the country, actually.
Really?
For many years, absolutely, absolutely. So, but you know, I would say particularly in the '60s and the '70s, it was a good time to be there. Yeah.
You know, a lot of things have kind of changed. Um, you know, what do you think is probably the most kind of prevalent thing that you see, you know, in general, that has changed?
That has changed. I would say that as things got more expensive, a few things happened. And this is once again before your time, but in the '80s, the crack epidemic happened, and I distinctly remember, and I was living on Wayne Avenue at that time, but I distinctly remember folks lining up. There would be guys with trash cans burning wood, right, to keep warm. They were selling crack, and people in the neighborhood would be lining up to buy crack cocaine, and it would just go on. The police would not do anything about it, and that's sort of one thing that led to the demise of the neighborhood. The other thing is, as a lot of the wealthier folks were able to move to the suburbs as they saw the neighborhood going, because a lot of people just moved out of Philadelphia in general. They wanted it because the school system started not being as good as it used to be, and et cetera, et cetera. So whatever reason, they would move to the suburbs. And a lot of them, as you know, you live in Germantown, a lot of those houses are huge. But at one point, they were all one-family homes, you know, all this. But after a while, people couldn't afford to keep those homes up, to heat those homes at night. So a lot of those houses got broken up into apartments. That was one of the big changes. And so as it became more of a renter neighborhood rather than, you know, a family neighborhood or a one-family neighborhood, that was one thing that changed a whole lot. That I think that all of a sudden you didn't know your next door neighbor that well, you know what I mean? And there's, you know, community is the whole thing. It's like, that's one of the big changes that happened, you know what I mean? And there's most of it was just driven by finances, you know.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I mean, especially now when you have all these, like, you know, newer kind of high-end apartments going up around the place.
Yeah.
And also, pretty recently, there was a whole block of houses for like $7 million that was being sold, and it was all renters.
Yeah, yeah. And you can see the same thing around here. I mean, it's just the whole culture. And that's what I mean when I say you knew your next door neighbor. And it sounds very trite, I guess, but it truly was. You were able to depend on. you were able to depend on your next door neighbor. Let's just put it that way. You know what I mean? And I mean, we're not living in Mayberry. I mean, it's. I mean, I know we're not in the rural South or something like that. But you were able to depend on if you didn't get home, if your mother didn't get home from work or couldn't get home at a certain time, she could call the neighbor up and say, "Can you watch the kids until until we get home?" You know what I mean? Can you feed the kids? You know, till I get home. Da da da. And you look. And people laugh about this, but a lot of times it was like hot dogs and bean casserole or whatever. You know what I mean? But there was just a more simplistic way of being able to depend on people. That's all. You know.
You know, you started your music career,
Yeah.
you know, at a very young age.
Yeah.
What, you know, got you into it? What drew you to music?
So it's so funny you ask that because, and this is what's one of the things that it's a shame with the Philadelphia school system now, and I really hate to talk about the Philadelphia school system because you don't know this, but my sister was superintendent of the Philadelphia school system for a couple of years, right? But when I was growing up, we all had to take a musical instrument. That was my mother's thing. And my mother, God rest her soul, was the kind of person that she wanted all of us to have a career that was not a blue-collar career. Now, ultimately, that probably wasn't a smart idea because I know a lot of people that are plumbers and carpenters now that are making $1 million, you know what I mean, making a whole lot of money. But she wanted us to go to school or to, you know, to go to college, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because that's what you did. You went to school, you went to high school, then you went to college, you know. But we all had to take a musical instrument. My first instrument was actually the French horn, right? And in those days, the school district actually had, we had an elementary school orchestra, but the school district actually had instruments that they could give us. So I had a French horn that, I didn't own it, but I could take it home with me. Do you know what I mean? And that's sort of kind of what got me started. Now, I had, I got fairly competent on it, but I was never really competent. What happened was, we used to play, the orchestra we used to play, and when I had to do a solo, I would sort of kind of improvise the solo a lot on the French horn, you know what I mean? Which, much to the chagrin of my music teacher, I think. But, but everybody, the kids we were able to have, we had violins they could give out to kids, of course the triangle and stuff like that, all that stuff. But these instruments were available if you wanted to make use of them, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so that was my first instrument. And then a very significant night happened, which you know nothing about, but I'll tell you, but maybe you do. And so it was in 1964, and this band came on the Ed Sullivan Show called The Beatles. And I was there that night. Actually, the whole family sat down and watched that night. And that was it for me. Once I saw that, I said, that's what I want to do. And I asked for a guitar for my birthday. I got it, and I started playing the guitar. I started as a guitar player, and did that for several years, and much to my parents' chagrin, I think, reached a point when I was about 14 or 15 and said, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do. And, it wasn't always fully supported by my parents because, it's like all of a sudden it's like, oh, now you want to be a rock and roll star, you know what I mean? You're not going to go to school, you want to be a rock. But that's the path that led me down there, yeah. And eventually I switched from guitar to bass, yeah.
When you were my age,
Yes.
Germantown was a center for activism and outreach.
Yes.
you know, there was a lot of activism, and there was a lot of, you know, music
Mm-hmm.
that was also, you know, kind of encouraging it. Um, do you think this is kind of similar what you're doing like here in the Falzer Club?
Uh, I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's obviously a different time, you know. Uh, when you say activism, I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on back then, the Vietnam War and all that sort of thing that was, uh, you know, obviously a focus of the activism
Yeah.
and the civil rights movement
The
and
Black
the
Panthers,
Black Panthers.
the Move bombings?
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that when that happened.
Oh, really?
I remember when that happened. And yeah, listen, I remember in the early '60s there were riots in North Philadelphia, like these you know, civil unrest or whatever you want to call it. And I remember my mother talking to my grandmother, who still lived in North Philly, about how the police were on top of the roof, you know, helicopters going around watching for people starting a riot or whatever, you know what I mean, or whether they're going to be rioting. But is that what I'm doing here at the Falzer Club? The only thing I'm trying to do with the Falzer Club is create a culture of just an atmosphere for musicians, for people that enjoy music, to be able to have a place that can come and they can come to and have the music be adventurous, have the music be original. But also the other thing that we're doing here, and hopefully we're succeeding at it or trying to succeed at it, is just to bring the community together, you know, for whatever reason, for the music. You know, we have a lot of things that go on here, you know what I mean, the community events. But just to get that connectivity of people just getting to know their neighbors, and that's one thing I like about East Falls, and which is sort of harkens me back to those days. I have keys to 4 of my neighbors' houses, you know, you know what I mean? Which is sort of to me unheard of, you know what I mean? But this is what I mean about this is what I like about this neighborhood. It really is a neighborhood, I think. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but as far as the activism is concerned, it's different times. It's just different times. There's no focal point like there was with the Vietnam War or something like that that everybody can circle around and you know, agree about or agree or disagree about. You know what I mean? But anyway, I don't know. So
I don't know. I think there might be,
okay.
but I don't know if anyone is kind of willing to really circle, you know, um, come together and like be, you know, have a single mind when it comes to like this one issue, you know?
Right. Yeah.
But
Go ahead.
oh, sorry.
Sorry.
But especially back then,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there was and still is a you know a lot of racism,
Sure. Certainly.
and you know, kind of going back on the point of you know music. Were there really obstacles from you know for a black musician, especially you know during kind of that time?
Well, I mean, I can only speak when I started seriously working as a musician, which was sort of kind of in my late teens, early 20s. You know, certainly being a black rock musician was an unusual thing, okay? Because as soon as, especially as a bass player, as soon, you know, everybody would assume right off the bat that you're in either a soul band or an R&B band. And not that there's anything wrong with that, I'm just saying, but you know, I grew up listening to Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, and that's the sort of music that I was interested in. You know what I mean? In playing, and there was certainly a lot of resistance. I say resistance is a strong word. Just people saw it as an oddity that I was, because for most of my life I was like the only black person in the band. You know what I mean? I was like the black bass player. You know what I mean? In the band, but. You know, I mean, it didn't really hold me back that much. In some ways, I think that and at that point in when I was younger days growing up, record labels actually held a lot of influence over the music industry. Not so much because most of it's now internet based. You know, people get to know things in different ways. But back in those days, the record labels sort of kind of were the gatekeepers of the music industry. And a lot of black musicians, especially black rock musicians, I don't think they really knew what to do with. Do you know what I mean? How are we going to market this? You know what I mean? And so, in that sense, yeah. But you know, there was certainly. But whenever I say that, listen, whenever I start talking about the issue of the racism thing, I have relatives of mine that I just discovered several years ago. I had an uncle who was light-skinned enough, who passed himself off as white for years and years and years.
Really?
And married a Caucasian woman and had children. And he would come and see us once a year at Christmas time, but he would sort of kind of get in and out, so nobody that knew he was related to us, because, you know, he had a good job because everybody thought he was white, you know, and that's what a lot of people did. It was called passing, you know what I mean, and that's what a lot of people did. So when people talk about racism and what the things, I mean, I certainly had to face certain things, but nothing like that. It's nothing like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's definitely kind of that happening, but I think it's almost in reverse, because in you know, a lot of popular media, it's, you know, black people kind of at the forefront.
Right. Forefront yeah.
Of it.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, kind of made, I don't know, some like people feel like, oh, where's, you know, my culture or whatever. So they're, you know, more likely to kind of adapt what they think, you know, black culture is.
Right.
And I think that's kind of interesting to see, like, you know, the inverse of what you're saying happen.
Well, I mean, when you really, if you go back, I mean, all the guys like, you know, Little Richard, stuff like that, they were all black. They were all black rock musicians, is what I'm saying. You know what I mean? And not, look, it's like rock and roll. Rock and roll was basically started in the black community. You know what I mean? It's basically like a southern thing. You know what I mean? Based on the blues and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And all those, you know, there was a thing called the British Invasion, where all those British bands came over here, but they were all playing music from that of black musicians, you know, and adapting it to the rock and roll thing. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, look, the record industry never really knew that much what to do with black. Listen, one of the biggest examples for me is two examples actually, which is Michael Jackson, right? Who puts out, you know, suddenly changes his image. Now, did he change his nose and all that sort of stuff? Yeah, absolutely. You know what I mean? But suddenly you had like millions of these white girls putting Michael Jackson's poster up on their wall, and the parents are like, "Who is this guy?" You know what I mean? People know how to deal with that. You know what I mean? And then Prince. You know, Prince is like one of those guys that's like crossed so many lines and boundaries between rock and roll and funk that it makes it interesting to see, okay, how are we going to market him? But with a lot of these guys are so talented, and their talent was so undeniable that the labels had to find a way to market them. I'm not and I'm going to say this on tape, which is probably going to get me in trouble, but I'm not a big fan of a lot of like the hip hop thing. I think a lot of it's been very destructive in terms of, and I mean, I know there's probably a lot of stuff that you maybe listen to, I don't know, but I think that a lot of the gangster rap has sort of kind of been a very destructive element in the black community.
I don't know. I think I might disagree because really it's more not, I think it's kind of a cycle where it's people kind of expressing their experiences through music, and then that blowing up and turning into kind of people trying to emulate that in, real life.
So, and not to challenge that, but if we went through, and we're not going to do that now, but we read through some of these lyrics, and let's just put it this way. My parents fought long and hard to have the N-word not be used, okay? And then to have the N-word used so casually in all these songs, to me is objectionable, because to me it's one of those things. I mean, yeah. So if you say something often enough, it becomes, it doesn't matter. It becomes non-dangerous. Or I can't think of the word I'm looking for.
They
But
kind
I
of
think
reclaimed it.
Huh?
They reclaimed
Yeah,
it.
they reclaimed it. But you know what? It reclaimed what? It's still to me, it's still an offensive word. And I'm of a certain age that I remember when that was what people called you. That's what people called you. You know what I mean? And then to have it so casually thrown around, to me, is not necessarily helpful. It's not. If you go back and listen to a lot of like like Stevie Wonder and all the Motown stuff, it's all sort of uplifting. It was uplifting music. It was music that people get ready. There's a train coming. You know what I mean? It's like it was all uplifting stuff. It wasn't stuff about. I know I'm sounding like an old guy, but it wasn't stuff about. Let me shoot this hoe, and you know what I mean. It's just like, and that's what a lot of this stuff is. I mean, it's like, and to me, doesn't have a lot to do with music. To me. Okay.
I think there's also kind of a element of while the lyrics and things like that might not be uplifting, a lot of the people are kind of uplifting themselves with the music, because a lot of the time they are from like the neighborhoods. Like one of my favorite artists, Kendrick, has he isn't really kind of that type of music. I think a lot of that type of music is kind of turned into things like drill, but in general,
And he's a little bit different, though, Kendrick Lamar.
True.
But yeah.
what I'm saying is, whenever a kind of topic is, or not topic, like a genre is that big, there's definitely going to be interesting people making interesting art,
True.
A lot of the time, a lot of people don't really remember some of the, worse bands, especially when they're like older, because nobody really knew about them.
Right. I mean, and look, I agree. And Kendrick Lamar is a little bit different. I mean, because he's not really of that ilk, you know. But, and I'll just say to you, it's you can take a look at a lot of things that are happening in our community nowadays. For whatever reason, it is happening, and I'm not blaming it all on music. Obviously, there's so many factors, but when you have all these kids just blatantly shooting other kids, and do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's just
yeah.
every day, every single day. And
Especially
so
in
then if
Philly.
you're listening to a constant diet of like, I'll put a cap in your ass, it's that to me, that's not helpful. You know what I mean? As opposed to, you know, a lot of cats that were saying, you just go back and listen to bands like the Temptations and, you know, and like I said, like Stevie and stuff like that. It was all Marvin Gaye. I mean, they were all like artists that were like sort of kind of trying to uplift the community. I guess that's my point. You know what I mean?
I think my point is people like Kendrick, not really anymore Kanye, but like Kanye, J. Cole, a lot of them are kind of doing the same thing.
Right.
And I think it's a bit of survivor's bias to look back and see all of like the amazing musicians and singers then. You know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
But
like I said, I'm old, so.
to move on from
Yeah,
that,
sure.
you know, you write about your dog a lot.
Yeah, Mr. Griffin.
What got you into doing that? What?
Well, you know, Mr. Griffin came to me about 8 years ago. This is Mr. Griffin, everybody. And we started taking a walk through. There's a very historical cemetery here called Laurel Hill Cemetery right up the street. And there's a lot of very beautiful monuments up there. It's amazing the way people used to bury themselves, actually, with these huge mausoleums. But it's a great place to walk through, and you'll see a lot of folks, a lot of famous folks that are, when I say famous, a lot of folks are buried up there where the streets on Philadelphia were named after. You'll see the Rittenhouses, you know. And then one day, Mr. Griffin and I were walking through, and he started talking to me out of the blue, right? And I used to call him Griffin, and then one day he said to me, I'd prefer if you called me Mr. Griffin. And so out of a deep amount of respect, I said, okay. And so as we kept walking through day after day, we just started having these conversations together. And it turned out that he was a lot smarter than I was. And so he would give me advice on life and living, and so I decided to start documenting our adventures as we walk through, and posting them on Facebook. And for whatever reason, people started responding to it, and really seemed to enjoy it. So I kept going with it, you know. So there are several Mr. Griffin. They're called Tales, T-A-I-L. They're Mr. Griffin Tales, and so that's been going on for the last 6-7 years, and you know, so yeah, that's how it all started with him, you know.
Unfortunately, that's about enough time, but I would like to ask you 2 questions.
Sure.
How do you see yourself? And how do you fear others perceive you?
Interesting question. I see myself as a person who followed their heart, followed their dream, had varying amounts of success. I was on the cusp of a lot of things that should have gone one way that didn't, and other things that went the way they should. But relatively happy. a certain amount of independence, you know. Certain things I regret in my life, in a way I regret not having kids, you know. Kaboom. How do I fear other people seeing? I consider myself to be a fairly accomplished musician, which is, you know, the only thing that can make that happen is a certain amount of dedication and practice, which I think I put in over the years. How do I fear other people see me? As a ne'er-do-well, as a person who did not live up to their potential, I guess. I guess that's the way that I fear other people see me, you know. But I try not to think too much about that, you know. I have a brother and sister that are very successful, you know what I mean, and they're successful in a different way than I was successful. You know, they went in a much straighter, narrower path than I did. You know, my brother was a college professor, my sister was an educator. I have a younger sister who's passed away, who she had a 4-year scholarship to Harvard University. You know, so, you know, I mean, you think about that sometime, like, you know, I could have been a rich man maybe if I didn't, like, decide to be a rock musician. But, you know, here we are, and it's 2023, and, you know, it is what it is.
This was this was Nigel for See Beyond My Skin with musician Gary Lee.
Thank you, brother.